Afternoon to everyone who's joining us for the PaxCon Reflections webinar series. I just wanted, as you all start to kind of filter in, just to give you a hello, just know that we will start at noon today in just a few moments. In the meantime, you can be sure to check around and get familiar with the features of Cisco's WebEx platform. Make sure that you're muted and maybe look at where the chat box is, as we will be accepting your questions today for our speakers. You can use that chat box at any time throughout the entirety of our program. And just settle in, get something to drink, get comfortable, and we'll be back at noon to start our presentation. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next PaxCon Reflections webinar in our series this year. We are so happy that you decided to take time out of your day to join us and share your lunch hour with us. My name is Leanna Vitale. I'm a naturalist at Jug Bay Wetland Sanctuary, and it's my pleasure to be the host for all of you today during this lunchtime hour presentation. We want to make you aware that this recording or this talk today will be recorded. If this is something that you don't wish to be a part of, we completely understand. You can exit the talk for now, but know that we will be putting a recording of this talk up on the PaxCon website so that you can watch it at your leisure if you prefer. Most everyone joining should be muted and with the option to turn your video on if you want to. So you can take some precautions if you prefer to have a little bit of privacy by muting yourself and turning off your video. It's also nice to see faces when we give presentations. So if you're comfortable with your video on, we'd be welcome for you to do that as well. We are, first and foremost, almost all of us, I think, on this call and tuning in, we are all scientists, and we are much more comfortable out in the forest and in the marshes mucking around than we usually are on all of these technology platforms. So as we're all adjusting to our kind of new world, we appreciate any kind of grace and gentle kindness that you can give us if we encounter any kind of technological snafus while we have today's talk. We appreciate your patience in advance, but we think we should be pretty good. Before we get started, just to share a few housekeeping notes with you related to this platform. This is the WebEx Cisco platform. So to make sure that you can see the chat and ask questions for our speakers, you can click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't want to see a list of the participants joining today, you can click the participants button and it should be minimized. There's also a way that you can take notes in the WebEx platform, which is pretty cool. You can click the three dots next to the chat, and when the webinar ends, your personal notes will be downloaded as a text file. We are in our 5th year of the Patuxent River Conference. And of course, the planning team was really looking forward to our meeting with everyone in person and to reflect on these last 5 years of work in the Patuxent River watershed and really dream about and brainstorm some good goals for the future. But as we all know, the last 7 months have not really gone as planned, probably for anybody. So instead, we're really excited to be evolving and kind of rolling with the punches to offer you this great webinar series. And in fact, we've focused it on topics that you, our conference attendees over the years, have stated to us are your most interesting topics. They include climate change and local impacts, stream restoration and stormwater management, wetland ecology, and outreach and advocacy for an improved river health and ecosystem. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat and share where in the Patuxent River watershed you live or you work. We always love to hear if you have a favorite spot along the river as well. The chat can be a really cool place to meet new people, even though we don't have our traditional networking. It's great to kind of see where people are hailing from and what you work on and some connections that can be made. So if you want to keep up to date with Patuxent River Conference in general, please do visit our website at www.paxcon.org. And we want to give a really big thank you and a huge shout out to our webinar series sponsors. These folks have really helped make this process much more easier for us as the planning committee, and then hopefully also put together a more seamless and enjoyable program for you. Thank you to all of our sponsors that are listed on the screen. We want to remind you that we are just approaching the halfway point with our PaxCon Reflection Series. Beyond today, there are 2 additional great talks that are on the horizon: Stream Ecology and Restoration on November 12th, and outreach and advocacy for river health on November 19th. So if you enjoyed today and spending this time with us over this lunch hour, we'd love to see you again at either or both of these future talks. So with that being said, I'd love to have the honor to introduce you all today to our two speakers. We are so thrilled to be welcoming Dr. Pat Megonigal and Dr. Karen Prestegaard with us today. Pat will be our first speaker. Pat is an Associate Director for Research and a Principal Investigator at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. She's an ecosystem ecologist with interests in carbon and greenhouse gas cycling in wetlands and forests, particularly as they relate to global change. Dr. Megonigal is the lead investigator of the Global Change Research Wetland, a world-class facility dedicated to unraveling the complex ecological processes that confer stability on coastal marshes as they respond to global environmental change. And Dr. Prestegaard is an associate professor in the Department of Geology at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she studies rivers, wetlands, watersheds, water quality, minerals, floods, and rainfall and watershed management. She has worked extensively on sediment and nutrient dynamics in the Patuxent River wetlands. So it's an absolute treat to have both of these folks with us today. And I'm going to go ahead and toss the ball over to our first speaker. And you might see a little bit of a lag as we do a transfer, but we'll get that going for you in just a bit. There you go, Pat. Should be good to go when you're ready.
Well, all right. Thanks for that nice introduction, Liana. And I also want to thank one of my favorite people, Patty Delgado, for inviting me to speak today. So I'll be talking about the broad topic of climate change, but I won't be saying anything about what we currently understand about the effects of climate change on the Bay. Rather, I'll be emphasizing a new program that will be a source of information for making those sorts of forecasts. And so it's a very future-looking talk that I'm talking about. And the main point of it is to introduce this new program called TEMPEST, which is coming out of the Department of Energy and will have a focus on Chesapeake Bay. Now, we're very lucky in Chesapeake Bay to have a rich network of academic and state and federally funded institutions that, collaborate on Bay research, a whole variety of topics, but of course, climate change is one of them. And here you see the logos on the right of, many of these. I'm sure I missed a few, so, please don't take that as an insult. That's about all I could fit on the slide. But yeah, Chesapeake Bay is very unique in this regard. But one logo that is not here is that of the Department of Energy. And the reason that's an important missing piece is because the Department of Energy builds the United States most sophisticated, I'd say among the world's most sophisticated Earth system models, the models that forecast climate. I'll say a little bit more about why I think DOE is very important in this space. DOE thinks big about these things. So their Earth system model is particularly advanced in incorporating the sorts of things that we as ecologists understand to be important about how particularly the land part of the Earth works. Here are shown just an example of some of the work that DOE has funded over the years. In the top left, DOE actually developed and then implemented the technology that allows us to expose large organisms in the form of trees to elevated carbon dioxide for the purposes of improving their Earth system models. That was mostly back in the 90s, and haven't done a good job of that with temperate forests. the Department of Energy has moved on to doing similar sorts of large-scale experiments in northern peatlands, because clearly these are important to the Earth's climate responses and climate change, tropical forests as well, and the Arctic. So, you know, Department of Energy is really trying to understand how Earth's ecosystems feed back and respond to climate, but have never really considered this at the land-sea interface, places like Chesapeake Bay. So this began to bubble up a number of years ago, and DOE started thinking about what they were calling their terrestrial aquatic interface program. And what you see on the left is the cover of a report that we published in 2016. I co-organized this workshop where we thought about these terrestrial aquatic interfaces in a very general way, including non-tidal and tidal systems. And you can see in the little boxes, you know, that we're thinking about processes that are important at a variety of scales, ranging from pores, you know, up to, you know, whole landscapes. That was followed up in 2018 by another workshop that was focused entirely on the coastal zone. And out of that workshop came this paper that was published this year in Nature Communications, where we discuss aspects of coastal systems that are absent but yet important to Earth system models. This gives you an idea of why having a renewed focus on modeling the terrestrial aquatic interface is so important. So in this image on the right side, is on the top here where it says current ESM, which is current Earth system model, what you're seeing is the way places like Chesapeake Bay are modeled at an Earth scale presently. Basically, the land contributes things like nutrients to a river. The river is a big pipe that runs into the ocean, like an effluent pipe, and dumps it. That's it. So, you know, clearly we're missing a lot of nuance here. And what you see in the bottom panel, coastal interface Earth system model, is more the vision of what we would like to be able to do at the coastal interface. We would like to have processes that represent the interaction of rivers with floodplains, that would represent tidal rivers with inflow and outflow, and estuaries with you know, all the complex processes that occur in places like that. So that's the vision of where this program would like to go. So here I'll introduce the program. It's called TEMPEST, Coastal Observations, Mechanisms, and Predictions Across Systems and Scales. And you can see that this title emphasizes both observations and predictions in the form of models, but importantly, that middle word, mechanisms, is how you get from something that we observe in the field to something we can actually model. The principal investigator and you know, really the leadership for this program comes out of the Pacific Northwest National Lab. They actually also have a satellite lab here in Chesapeake Bay. Vanessa Bailey is the principal investigator, and I'm the chief scientist on this project. On the left side at the bottom, you can see the many collaborators who I didn't list here, and most of whom are associated with the national labs, but there's also Smithsonian Environmental Research Center here in the Chesapeake Bay, and in the Great Lakes, University of Toledo, and Michigan Tech University. The two questions that we're hoping to address, the first is, you know, we want to understand the ecology, biogeochemistry, and hydrology of these systems. You'll hear more about that from Karen, that are important in these coastal interfaces. And then we want, in the second question, to be able to essentially model those dynamics. and to do that in a way that recognizes and is respectful of all the scales that influence those processes, not just, one scale, not just one site or one plot. And what you see here in this figure that I used is a recent paper by Fegan et al. In 2020, published, I think, in Global, I think it was in Global Change Biology, where they did something like this for gross primary productivity in tidal wetlands across the US. It's a very nicely done attempt to cross scales and predict a process, in this case, plant productivity, that's important in these systems. So one thing that sets this project apart is that the domain is very much at the coastal interface. It does include uplands, it includes wetlands, and it includes near shore sediments and tidal creeks and tidal rivers. That's the domain that we're most interested in being able to model accurately, but of course that is embedded in a much larger domain, which I'll say something about in a moment. And the processes we want to be able to model are element cycling of various sorts, inclusive of microorganisms, plants, and their net effect on redox dynamics, interacting with open water. And if we're successful at all this, we'll be able to provide improved forecasts of the effects of storm surge, which is one important effect of climate change, sea level rise, and how those interact with eutrophication, all very important topics in Chesapeake Bay. The Department of Energy has a is very committed to what they call their MODEX philosophy. MODEX is a combination of the words model and experiment. And this, for the Department of Energy, is much more than just lip service. The proposal we wrote and are close to having funded, is very explicit about how the data supports the model. And by that, I mean field and lab data support the models, and the models support the data. And so everything that's done in this project is about coupling those two to provide better forecasts. The models are multi-scale, ranging from the scale of individual reactions that happen, for example, at the root surface, up to sites that you would recognize, like Jug Bay, watersheds, from small to large. And then, even though we won't get here initially in our 2-year pilot study, eventually to the regional and global Earth system scale. There's a lot of information on this slide, and I'm not going to try to go through it all. Really, what I want you to see in this slide is kind of the hierarchy that I had on the last slide, but in this case with a little bit more detail. So you can see on the left, there's this reaction scale that's very much about biogeochemistry at small scales. The way that plays out on transects, transects being from upland forest down into nearshore water, and then further at watershed scales. And at each of those scales, there is a suite of models. These acronyms will mean nothing to you probably. I'm not even sure I understand them all. But the point is that at each scale, there's a collection of models that are oriented towards microbes or plants or the movement of water and hydrology. And the idea is to couple those, and then to couple those from that scale to higher order scales using similar types of structures, such that the models can talk to one another, pass parameters back and forth. And then on the right are the measurements that will be used to either initialize the models, parameterize them, or evaluate them. And again, those measurements will be made at different scales to support the models at those scales. So this makes the project very different than any other program I'm familiar with in a coastal system. I mentioned that this is currently viewed by DOE as a pilot project funded for 2 years, or I'm hoping to hear confirmation of that soon. And they picked 2 regions to pilot in, the Mid-Atlantic, centered on Chesapeake Bay, and the Great Lakes region. Now, these would seem to be very different coastal systems, and that is absolutely true. But it's kind of exciting because, you know, the Great Lakes, which is strictly fresh water, should share processes that are similar to the freshwater areas of Chesapeake Bay, that is the freshwater tidal areas. And while the Great Lakes do not have tides per se, they have seiches, which are very similar to tides. And in fact, the tidal range, if you want to call it that, the seiche range in the Great Lakes is actually a little bigger than the tidal range of Chesapeake Bay. So, and then, you know, while we're experiencing sea level rise, the Great Lakes is experiencing lake level rise at the moment. So, you know, there's enough similarity among these regions that if we build models that are truly capable of being expanded to the whole US and then to the whole world, they should be able to work in these 2 regions as well. So I think it's a very nice way to bookend this pilot project. So for those of us who do field work, it's very exciting that you know, that there will be field work going on here in the Chesapeake Bay, new field work. And you can see over here kind of an outline of the Chesapeake Bay and these little symbols that look like people or, you know, hexagons and so forth that map onto these 3 activities: experiments, synoptic observations, and what we're calling the exchange program. And I'll say just a couple things about each real quick. So field and lab experiments will be undertaken. And some of these will be done at very small scales and very simplistic microcosms, and that's what these little jars are representing. And others will be done at larger kind of ecosystem scales. In particular, I'll mention in a moment a new experiment that's here on the property of the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center that's part of this program. Synoptic studies are transect oriented. I mentioned that transects are part of the modeling framework, and I'll say just a little bit more about that. But whereas our field experiments will happen at just one site, there'll be anywhere from 3 to 6 perhaps of these, what we're calling synoptic sites, where we'll make monthly observations over the course of 2 years and possibly over the course of a decade to capture spatial and temporal variability. But there'll also be what we're calling mobile versions of these sites that might be able to make similar measurements at up to 20 or 30 sites over a period of 2 or 3 years around Chesapeake Bay. And then the last category is this exchange program, which is meant to be a partnership with groups like NEARS or, you know, people like Karen, you know, where we will develop these field sampling kits and collaborate with dozens, maybe hundreds of partners to collect a certain very focused set of samples over a very short period of time, but then subject those to some very high-end, very sophisticated and expensive chemical analyses that, you know, can provide useful data for the models, but also really unique data for the partners that they wouldn't be able to get otherwise. And, you know, this would be operated free of charge to our exchange program partners. I mentioned a field experiment. So this is at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, adjacent to the Global Change Research Wetland, which is that wetland that's behind me at the moment in the picture. And this is a very ambitious experiment to subject upland forests to simulated storm events, either storm surge, where seawater would be pushed up out of Chesapeake Bay into an upland forest that hadn't experienced it in the past, or from freshwater that we would apply, simulating, a very intense rainstorm, which is, of course, what we're expecting with climate change. And what you see in these images are just are outlines of these very large 2,000 meter square plots, unreplicated, that will be that we've built now and we'll be starting to apply experimental treatments to next summer. And then I've mentioned these transects from uplands into marshes, which will cross ghost forests. And so we're very much interested in how uplands become ghost forests and ghost forests become marshes. These transitions that are happening in Chesapeake Bay and elsewhere. So with that, I just want to thank all of you for listening to this new program. And yeah, thank you, PaxCon. I'm a big fan. I live along the Patuxent River and big fan of this conference.
Well, we are very happy to have you be part of this today. Thank you so much for that. That was incredible. And you're kind of getting off the hook a little bit. Oh, I think we do have one question for you, coming from one of your dear buddies, Dr. Patricia Delgado. She's asking, what are the data sources to populate the models you introduced? They seem to require a considerable amount of data, which some may not be available. How are data gaps being identified and prioritized? So one, where are your data sources and how are you handling gaps in data for your models?
Yeah, and that's a insightful question, Patty. Yeah, the models, these are mechanistic models. They're demanding in terms of data, and that data will come from three sources, I would say. One is they will come, we will definitely be working with partners like USGS, NEARS, other partners at NOAA and USDA and so forth, to fully leverage the very rich databases that already exist in the Chesapeake Bay, and NEARS, of course, is a major source of that. And so that's one. Then we will be in our field experiments collecting new data that doesn't really exist. So we will not be focused on data that we think people have already collected, but focus on some new data. And then finally, we'll be using advanced analytical tools like intelligent, various sorts of artificial intelligence to try to model statistically certain types of parameters.
Thanks for that, Pat. If anyone else has any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box. If you have another insightful question that comes to you even during Karen's talk, you can also still put it in the chat box for Pat, and we can ask him those questions at the end as well. All right. Pat, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For that. Yeah, hang out with us and come and enjoy Karen's talk, and we're going to catch up with you again at the end for some final reflections. All right, so Karen, I'm going to go ahead and toss you the presenter ball now that I know even better how to do it. It's going to come on over to you. And when you're ready, you can turn on your video if you're interested, and also unmute yourself, and you will be ready to go for your talk. And we can see it well.
Okay, I hope you can all hear me okay.
I can hear you. Sounds
all
good.
Right. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is some of the inner details of what we got in the overview from Pat. I'm going to talk about freshwater tidal wetlands, and particularly look at how the tidal channels themselves and the tidal inlets that connect to the main part, let's say the Patuxent River, are important control points for how these systems operate. So we'll be looking at tidal wetland channels, their morphology, and their functions. And for some reason, my screen has frozen up here. All right. So we all know that there's both freshwater and saltwater wetlands, but both of these contain some of the same features. They're self-formed systems. In other words, as sea level rises, accretion occurs on marsh platforms, and the channels form within that. And the characteristics of the channels are network characteristics. They're fairly systematic as a function of basin area. We get longer stream lengths with longer basin areas, but of course, everything's limited by the range of the tides itself. As the organic matter grows, dies, and accretes, we end up having most of the tidal marshes with a lot of organic matter and then also some sediment that comes down in them as well. The characteristics of the marshes are such that they create low oxygen conditions and good sites for denitrification and the storage of sediment as well. So they're very important in terms of the functions of these systems in terms of collecting sediment and improving water quality through things like denitrification. But if we look at these channels carefully, we can see that there's a lot of things happening that might affect the stability of these systems. And we also need to think about it in the long term as well. If we look at freshwater tidal wetlands today and their characteristics, we might think that they've always been there. So what you see on the screen right now is one of the first of the tidal net wetland systems within the upper Patuxent River. So this is fresh water. That means the water comes down from the river, the Patuxent River, and then it sort of pushes back and forth as the tide is coming into the lower part of the river. It pushes that fresh water back, and then it goes out again during the high flows. So you can think a little bit about what's actually happening here during really big river flood events. It's like a locomotive going downstream. You have high velocities, a high volume of water, so you've got a lot of momentum. That's mass times velocity, or you can think of momentum flux if you do it per second. So you have a big amount of water pushing out, and that's going to push the fresh water even further downstream. And it's going to bring with it nutrients and other things that can be pushed back into all these tidal channels. During storm surges or big high tides, the opposite happens, and there's a big push coming from the other direction, but it's not making it all the way up into the upper parts of these systems. It's just pushing the fresh water back and mixing it a bit more. But we still see pulses of fresh water come down with every single flood. If you look at the Eyes on the Bay data and stuff, you see almost an inverted hydrograph with the diluted salinity of these things. Okay, so how do these tidal inlets and how do these tidal marshes affect what's going into these marshes and how sediment and nutrients are being retained? One of the things we should think of is how these tidal marshes formed and how they respond to changes in sea level and sediment supply. We're probably looking at these systems with a low amount of sediment supply right now because of dams and other features along this part of the Patuxent River, whereas other river systems like the nearby Anacostia might have fairly high sediment supplies coming from urban erosion. If we look over the past 200 years, probably what happened is that freshwater tidal wetlands were being built because of the agricultural era legacy sediment that was coming down and actually helping to build and maintain these marshes, although it probably affected things like submerged aquatic vegetation and emergent aquatic vegetation. So now we're in a recovery phase of vegetation, and we're seeing these channels adjust to, in this case, an invasive species, Hydrilla, but also the native species that form tidal channels. So as the tides change over the month from the spring tides with a full and new moons to the neap tides in between, we see an increasing amount of water being moved into these systems and then back out again. What the vegetation that grows in the channels along the sides of the channel does is it actually reduces the velocity. So as the water is coming up into the stream, the velocities are are slowing down, and the velocities are highest at the mouth, and they're the slowest upstream. And what this does is the water comes in, it forces the discharge to kind of spill over onto the marsh platform itself. And this is more effective when the channels are rougher, but it also restricts the amount of flow that goes into these marshes. So we've been looking at all the different ways that vegetation growing within the channels themselves affects the sediment retention and also affects the amount of water that goes into these marshes and the stability of these marshes. And this is just one piece of information about that. You can see a kind of a fuzzy picture of one of my students, Anastasia Witz here, looking at a Patuxent marsh, and this is one that has a lot of nufer or spatterdock growing in the channel itself. And that nufer or spatterdock makes essentially a secondary platform below the main marsh platform. So you can see the main marsh platform and then these lower platforms of spatterdock. And so these marshes have sort of a funny shape to their channels. They have a very deep V-shaped part of the channel, and the depth of that part of the channel really allows water to move fairly quickly and up into the channel system. If the water couldn't move quickly somewhere at the inlet and get a lot of water in a short amount of time, you wouldn't get enough water into the channel system to be able to extend all the way up into the upper part of the marshes. So that depth at the inlet is a really important controlling factor. But the vegetation along the side, this spatterdock, the nufer, is maintaining the stability of the system because it creates so much additional flow resistance that it forces all of the effective shear stress shown here in red into this deep, narrow part of the channel, and everywhere else, all the other kind of boundary parts here, you have shear stresses below that to really entrain sediment. And so as a result, we see that the annual accretion within the channels itself, not within the marsh platform, is inversely related to the maximum depth of the channel. The deeper channels actually have less accretion than the bigger channels or the smaller channels. And this probably means that the smaller channels get smaller over time and the bigger channels get bigger, but we're not entirely sure whether there's some other dynamics to that that really affects that. So if we're thinking about water that's coming from different sources and moving into these tidal marshes, one of the things that we know is that water coming down from the terrestrial part of the system is bringing with it things like sediment and nitrogen, phosphorus, a lot of things we don't really want to see out in the bay itself. And so we've been looking at how these tidal marshes are processing nitrate, and in particular looking at how the organization of the channel networks along this, the tidal marshes along the channel network affect this denitrification. So nitrate retention in freshwater tidal marshes, well, it looks like a great place to store a denitrified wetland, because if we can get the water into these systems and flood it out onto the marsh systems themselves, there's a lot of oxygen or carbon-rich environments, which are pretty perfect sites for denitrification to occur, particularly if it has a long enough residence time. So we did a series of mass balance measurements to look at the nitrate load in and the nitrate load out of various tidal marshes. Here's a bunch of them that we sort of schematically drawn a cartoon on. And one of the points I'm making in this schematic diagram, which is really plunked down right on top of the air photo, is that every little node along this system is a place where water is moved into the marsh through a tidal inlet and then into all of the marsh channels themselves. And so the actual inlet characteristics define how much water and how much nitrate are getting into the marshes. And so if we look at a series of marshes of different sizes, and we've now looked at quite a few along this channel system, we can then look at how marshes of various sizes, how much water gets in, literally the volume over a tidal cycle, how much nitrate gets in, and then how much nitrate goes back out again. So here's some of our data showing the relationship between the water volume that goes in over an entire tidal cycle and the amount of nitrate retention. And you can see one of the things that's apparent here. Here I'm just showing data from 3 different freshwater tidal wetlands looking at this mass balance of nitrate. This is work that I did with Emily Seldom-Ridge. And what you see here is that as the volume of water moving into the marsh increases, the nitrate retention pretty much goes up with it. And so the volume of water going into the marsh is one of the major controls on the nitrate retention, because if you can't get the nitrate that's in the water up into the marsh system, nothing's going to happen to it. And so we use that sort of spatial organization of all these marshes along the system as a way to scale from our field experiments of looking at nitrate retention to scaling up to the whole ecosystem. So the scaling relationships required some of the information we were gathering about the discharge. We know that the inlet width is related to the maximum amount of water that goes in during a tidal cycle. This is the instantaneous discharge. And then we also know there's a relationship between instantaneous discharge and water volume. And we can actually measure these relationships and then use these relationships to scale up to the whole system. To scale up to the whole system, we measured the inlets of all the tidal marshes. So here's a graph showing the cumulative number of widths and the channel widths of all of these systems. And what that shows you is that there's an awful lot of tiny, tiny little marshes in the system. There's a few marshes that are actually quite big with inlet sizes between about 20 and 100 meters. When we looked at and then scaled up the relationship I showed you previously, which is the relationship between tidal volume and nitrate retention, we scaled that relationship up using the hydraulic scaling relationships. We could estimate how much nitrate retention was occurring in each of these inlets in these marshes by looking at the inlet channel characteristics. So here you can see in red the cumulative percent of the inlet widths, and that just tells you that 50% of the inlets have widths that are less than 1 meter. About 83% of the inlet widths have widths that are less than 10 meters. But those 80% are actually doing very little of the total ecosystem nitrate retention, which is shown there in the black line, because so much more water goes into the larger inlets and is carrying with it so much more nitrate. And there's so many more places on that marsh surface for it to move into the marsh sediments and undergo denitrification and come back out again, and the retention times are longer. As a result of all those factors, these larger wetlands, of which there are not that many of them, you literally count that there's 10 of them or so within that upper part of the Patuxent River that are doing 50% of the total ecosystem nitrate retention. And they actually don't occupy 50% of the space. And that has some implications, because one of the things you'll notice is that when we put roads and bridges and other things, we often don't pay much attention to whether we're taking a big marsh and cutting it in two, or just putting the road over a small marsh. And we actually, in the upper part of the Patuxent, the Highway 4 bridge has cut in half, essentially, one of the larger marshes in the system, making it behave in a much different way than it did in the past. I just wanted you to think about the next time you look at these tidal inlets, as you're out kayaking, you're driving past, is think of them as the gatekeepers for water, sediment, nitrate, flux of everything going into the channel, and that as sea level rises, the inlet maximum depth increases. That allows more water, more sediment to get into the channel, and that's going to push the marsh further into the upland. So it's going to change the terrestrial water interface, one of the things that Pat was talking about earlier. We're seeing that the stability of these marsh channels is greatly enhanced by the submerged and emergent aquatic vegetation, and that the importance of these larger wetlands, which are more important than we expect just based on their aerial percentage for nitrate retention, than the smaller wetlands, or even the accumulation of all the small wetlands. And that's actually a little bit different than what we saw in terrestrial systems where small headwater streams are the ones that are doing a lot of the biogeochemical work for us. And partly this is just a different type of a system where these larger wetlands are still kind of headwater systems in the sense that they are where the exchanges are going on between terrestrial and now the wetland systems, which is going from essentially aquatic back to the terrestrial system in the context of what Pat had talked about. Thank you.
All right, Karen, thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a question for you, Karen. We're interested in learning how the relationship between inlet width and nitrate retention translate to inlet width and sediment retention. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one relationship. Of course, sediment's being carried in suspended load, and nitrate is carried in solution. And so the nitrate is going with the water. Instead, what's happening with the sediment is that because velocities aren't very high in freshwater tidal channels, as the sediment's coming up in the system, the coarser sediment's being dropped about a third of the way up into the system. So the coarser silt, it's all silt and smaller stuff, except for during extreme storms. You get a lot of that stuff dropping out, and it's being captured by a lot of that vegetation on the way in. And so the upper part of the marsh is retaining less coarse sediment than the lower part, and that probably has implications for what happens with sea level rise and what parts of the marsh might actually be accreting at different rates. But what that might be is a trade-off with maybe faster growth of vegetation in the upper parts of the marsh versus the lower part. But we do see some upper parts of marshes sometimes not quite keeping pace with sea level rise. But they're not as coupled closely together as you think, and that's because of the slow velocities that really affect deposition within these channels.
Thank you. You're taking me back to my grad level physics and like hydrology, which gives me like a little bit of stress sweats, but overall,
yeah,
it's really good.
It's a great kind of area to be in if you like integrating biogeochemistry, hydraulics, and geomorphology.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we have a follow-up question for you. How does different vegetation types influence sediment retention in these channels, in your opinion and your experience?
Yeah, so what we've looked at so far is when we've looked at the channels, we looked at Nufer, the spatterdock, the wild rice, and the Hydrilla. Mm-hmm. And the Hydrilla is actually growing in the channels itself. It has the grows in the deepest of the water. The Nufer grows in between, and the wild rice at the shallowest level. Nufer and wild rice were similar in their abilities to trap sediment in the channels. And this is even though the Nufer doesn't quite have the same density and it decomposes faster. And a lot of this is because it actually changed the channel hydraulics. It creates that bench and that forces all the flow into the center of the channel. So we were very surprised by that when we did the work. We thought Nufer and wild rice would behave very differently, but they both built these benches within the channel that then were maintained during the winter condition when they died back because of the morphology of the bench itself.
Sure.
So that was kind of cool. Hydrilla does nothing, and that's because Hydrilla propagates itself by having all those little pieces of the vegetation just roll off and move down to the channel and get washed up on some other marsh somewhere. And so it's designed to let itself get eroded from the bed of the stream. So it's not staying in place and helping accretion at the place where it grows in the channel for the most part. Huh. Yeah. And it decomposes very quickly. And I had an artist friend of mine make paper out of all these different kinds of vegetation, and the Hydrilla stuff just rotted away. It was really gross, she said.
Oh, what a really cool intersection, though, of science and art.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah.
That's awesome. Your very good friend Pat here also had a follow-up question for you. He asked, would we expect tidal wetlands to behave in the opposite direction, like more like upland streams, for things like DOC, for which the marsh is a source rather than a sink?
I think that the marshes are likely sources for DOC. It's not something I've been looking at in these tidal marshes. In fact, the last 5 years I've been mainly working up in Newfoundland on carbon storage in very different types of boreal forest systems, but looking at the aquatic terrestrial interface there. But I'm back thinking about these because these are all places where there's a lot of carbon being stored. But what we're seeing in Newfoundland in this boreal forest is, even though it's storing a lot of carbon, if the water is moving through there more frequently, it is actually taking out more DOC, and there's a really fine balance between organic matter storage and DOC being a source rather than a sink. And it's easy to cross over that boundary in a lot of these systems. I think in these freshwater tidal marshes, DOC may be a source of DOC rather than a sink for DOC. Although there's a lot of organic matter accretion every year.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of decomposition too.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for that, Karen. So Pat, you're back on the hot seat again. Dr. Megonigal, you've got a couple questions back for you if you're game for it. Someone would like to know, is NASA a collaborator to your COMPASS effort?
We have been in touch with NASA, and right now the COMPASS is in a pilot phase, and these collaborations across agencies are something that we expect to evolve, over the next 2 years. But NASA is going to be an important partner because, related to Patty's last question, they're a wonderful source of spatial data, and our goal is to, have good spatial coverage. So we expect to lean heavily on NASA data products.
That makes sense then. And a follow-up, not exactly in that same vein, but about your work in general. Is there a way for citizen scientists to get involved with your data collection? Or are there other ways that citizen scientists who are pretty inspired by your work that they can support that work?
Well, that's a fun question to think about. This exchange program would, comes to mind as the most likely place where we would engage citizen scientists. And, my understanding of it is that it could very well be sampling that, would be that say the river keepers, would be able to do. And so I do see a role perhaps through the exchange program. But yeah, other than that, I think it would be through the citizen science programs that are run by the individual sites where we might work, like CERC. We have a citizen science program that, that where we engage volunteers from all over the Bay, and so be happy to engage people that way.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. And as we're kind of nearing the end here, one last question that's here for both Karen and Pat. So maybe we'll ask Karen first, and then Pat, you can round it out. What are your expectations for future conditions or trends as they relate to your field of study in the Patuxent River, the Chesapeake Bay River, or the Chesapeake Bay watershed? What do you kind of think? Do you have any ideas based on your experience in the past, what you can kind of predict for future conditions and trends?
So one of the interesting things you can see, even in the upper part of the Patuxent, which is way upstream, is you can see a lot of trees dying back at the margins of the marshes that are currently there. And what that tells me is that as sea level is rising and we're deepening the channels and water is getting further up into that margin of the terrestrial marsh boundary, is the marshes are pushing back. And so we're extending the marshes at the terrestrial side. And I don't know if the tree death, and actually nobody knows if the tree death is due to changes in salinity, changes in the frequency of inundation, or a combination of those two. I'm part of a critical zone observatory here in Maryland, but one of our collaborators is also working on that exact problem on the more coastal parts of the bay, and the salt marshes as well. And so we're seeing the growth of the marshes. What we don't know is if they're shrinking on the riverside. So if they're extending backwards into the uplands, but eroding on the front side as sea level rises, then they might maintain their size over time. We don't know that, but we certainly do see the tree death and the pushing of the marshes into the terrestrial part of the system.
Thank you so much. Pat, what do you think?
Well, I mean, maybe just to pick up on what Karen was saying, you know, that question about whether salinity or increased flooding is impacting forests is, by the way, the point of that TEMPEST experiment that I talked about. And so, you know, but yeah, the critical zone observatory that Karen mentioned, by the way, is another, you know, really exciting program that has been funded at more or less the same time as this COMPASS program. So suddenly the Chesapeake Bay is, you know, we're moving into a decade where we're going to have just incredible data and model resources. And, you know, my gut feeling about what that is, you know, what's coming in the future is tidal wetland loss. I mean, you know, there's been a lot of work over the past couple of decades, I'd say, on the capacity of these marshes to gain elevation through sediment deposition and plant productivity. And we know that there's some critical rate of sea level rise that beyond which, you know, they simply will not be able to add elevation. And there's a lot of things working against wetlands in the Chesapeake Bay. The Mid-Atlantic is actually kind of a global hotspot for absolute sea level rise. It's a hotspot for land subsidence. So between the two of them, the rates of relative sea level rise are very, very high. And then it has a very small tidal range. And even though we focus a lot on the sediments in the bay, it's actually a pretty low sediment system compared to other systems. So all those things, I think, you know, the wetlands can handle at this point. But once rates of sea level rise, which is accelerating, it's accelerating. Once it hits a critical level of about 1 centimeter per year or something, then we're going to start to see them, you know, die. And that's where this process that Karen was mentioning of marshes moving into upland forest becomes so important, because that's one way of maintaining those systems within the landscape. But to do so, we have to provide them area to migrate into. So I think from a policy perspective, limiting development where they're adjacent to these, on land, adjacent to these tidal systems is going to be increasingly important over the course of this century.
Absolutely. And some staff at Jug Bay went to visit Blackwater Wildlife Refuge recently, and they were explaining a similar process. And when there's that that claiming of the forest land as the wetlands are migrating, you have that greater risk of invasive species also coming in and colonizing it. And that's kind of where they're in the middle of figuring out, do we work on expanding the existing wetlands or protecting that forest where they're eventually going to migrate through? And how do we keep that safe from invasive so that we just don't have an entire new future marsh of frag, basically? Well, thank you both so much for spending this hour with us. We so appreciate your time and your expertise in sharing everything that you have to share just in these short 15 minutes. We can definitely have an hour for each of you and have some great, really great talks and experiences. Thank you also to our participants who joined us today and spending your time with us. We so appreciated you coming and also giving us your great and insightful questions. And last but not least, certainly not least, thank you to our many partners and sponsors that help make PaxCon possible year after year, and also those that jumped in during a pretty clutch year this year for us to make this webinar series as great as we can make it. So with that being said, again, Pat and Karen, thank you so, so much. We hope to see you again at future PaxCon conferences. Your work is incredibly relevant. And for the rest of you, we hope to see you at our next Reflections webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go PaxCon.
Woo!
Yeah, absolutely.